The radio crackled with static, then died. Colonel Marcus Reeves stared at the handset like it had personally betrayed him, his weathered face illuminated by the amber glow of the command post's emergency lighting. Outside, the sound of distant artillery grew closer, a rhythmic thunder that made the sandbags around their position vibrate with each impact. "Sir, we've lost contact with Bravo and Charlie companies," Sergeant First Class Rodriguez reported, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Last transmission was Grid 779er, taking heavy fire from dug-in positions." Reeves set down the radio and studied the tactical map spread across the folding table. Red marks indicated enemy positions, too many of them, scattered across the valley like a constellation of death. His battalion had walked into what the intelligence officers called a target-rich environment. What they'd actually found was a killing field. The mission had seemed straightforward 12 hours ago. Insert via helicopter, secure the valley, eliminate the weapons cache, extract before dawn. Standard operating procedure for the 75th Ranger Regiment. But intelligence had been wrong about the enemy's strength, wrong about their positions, wrong about everything that mattered when bullets started flying. Now 2 companies were cut off, ammunition running low, casualties mounting. The extraction helicopters couldn't penetrate the dense surface-to-air missile coverage that had materialized like a deadly spider web across their only escape routes. Close air support was 40 minutes out, too long for the men bleeding in the rocks below. "Colonel," the radio operator called out, adjusting his headset. "Overlord is requesting status update." "Tell Overlord we need immediate air support," Reeves replied, his jaw tight. "Anything they've got." "Sir, they're saying negative on close air support. Too much AAA, too much risk. They want us to hold position until the corridor clears." Reeves felt something cold settle in his stomach. Hold position. Military speak for you're on your own. He'd heard those words before in other valleys, other wars. They never got easier. The artillery was getting closer now. Through the reinforced walls of the command bunker, he could hear the sharp crack of small arms fire mixing with the deeper boom of mortars. Somewhere out there in the darkness, American soldiers were fighting for their lives with dwindling hope and empty magazines. That's when the radio came alive with a voice that cut through the static like a blade. Calm, confident, and completely unexpected. "Reaper 6-1 to Overlord, I'm 15 mics out, requesting immediate tasking." The voice was crisp, professional, and undeniably female. In the sudden silence of the command post, it sounded like salvation wrapped in radio protocol. Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Vex Morrow had been flying combat missions when most of the Rangers in that valley were still learning to tie their boots. Her A-10C Thunderbolt II, call sign Reaper 6-1, was configured for tank-busting operations 300 miles north when she intercepted the emergency frequency. The mission brief was classified, the target coordinates were fluid, and officially, she wasn't supposed to be monitoring that channel at all. None of that mattered when she heard the strain in the ground commander's voice. "Reaper 6-1, Overlord," came the response, heavy with bureaucratic caution. "You are not assigned to this AOR. Recommend you continue to designated target." Vex banked her aircraft slightly, the twin General Electric TF-34 engines humming with barely restrained power. Below, the landscape rolled past in shades of brown and green, peaceful from 30,000 feet. She'd been flying for 16 hours straight, her body sustained by nothing but adrenaline and the knowledge that somewhere, someone needed what she could deliver. "Overlord Reaper 6-1, I've got 30 Mike rockets and a full load of Maverick missiles. Those boys sound like they could use some help." The pause stretched long enough for her to check her fuel gauges and run through her weapons systems one more time. Everything was green, everything was ready. All she needed was permission to do what she'd trained for her entire adult life. "Negative Reaper 6-1, return to mission." Vex had been in the Air Force for 14 years, and she'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do and the thing you were ordered to do existed in different universes. She thought about the voice she'd heard on the emergency frequency, young, scared, but trying to hold it together. She thought about the silence that followed. Overlord Reaper 6-1, I'm experiencing radio difficulties. Say again your last. It was a lie, and everyone on the frequency knew it, but it was the kind of lie that sometimes saved lives. She pushed the stick forward and began her descent. In the command bunker, Colonel Reeves was staring at the radio like it might start dispensing miracles. The female pilot, Reaper 6-1, had gone quiet after requesting grid coordinates. For all he knew, she'd been ordered back to whatever mission she'd abandoned to help them. Movement 2 o'clock, someone called from the observation post. Through the reinforced windows, Reeves could see muzzle flashes winking like malevolent stars across the valley floor. His scattered companies were taking fire from 3 directions now, caught in a crossfire that would grind them down to nothing if something didn't change soon. The radio crackled again. Ground control, Reaper 6-1. I have visual on friendlies, marked with IR strobes. Confirm weapons free on anything that's shooting at them. Reeves grabbed the handset so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee. Reaper 6-1, this is ground control. Weapons free, weapons free. Danger close authorization granted. Copy danger close. Beginning attack run. Recommend your people keep their heads down. Through the observation windows, Reeves could see nothing but darkness and the occasional flash of gunfire. Then, from somewhere low and fast, came the sound that every infantryman learned to love, the distinctive whine of turbofan engines pushed to maximum power. The A-10 was invisible against the night sky, but her presence filled the valley like the promise of divine intervention. The first burst of cannon fire lit up the darkness like a string of deadly pearls. Vex had found her targets using nothing but the infrared signature of their muzzle flashes, and the GPS coordinates burned into her targeting computer. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the nose of her aircraft was designed to punch through tank armor, but it worked just as well on fortified positions and the unfortunate souls hiding behind them. She rolled inverted and pulled the aircraft into a steep dive, the G-forces pressing her deep into her ejection seat. Through her night vision goggles, the world below resolved into geometric patterns of heat and movement. Enemy positions showed up as bright clusters of thermal signatures, while friendly forces appeared as cooler, more dispersed patterns marked by the infrared strobes they'd activated on her instructions. Guns, 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 she announced over the radio, her voice steady despite pulling 4 GS in a 60-degree dive. The cannon fired in 3-second bursts, each burst containing roughly 200 rounds of depleted uranium projectiles moving at 3,000 feet per second. The effect on the enemy positions was immediate and devastating. She pulled out of the dive and climbed back to attack altitude, already selecting her next target. The radio was alive with chatter now, ground controllers calling out new coordinates, forward air controllers adjusting fire, and underneath it all, the voices of soldiers who suddenly found themselves with room to breathe. Reaper 6-1, magnificent shooting, Colonel Reeves transmitted. Enemy fire has decreased significantly. Can you hit the positions on the North Ridge? Working on it now, Vex replied, banking toward the new coordinates. Through her targeting pod, she could see the muzzle flashes Colonel Reeves was talking about, a line of fortified positions that had been hammering the trapped companies from elevated ground. This time she selected rockets instead of the cannon. The Hydra 70 rockets streaked away from her aircraft like angry meteors, each one guided by her targeting computer to within meters of its intended impact point. The explosions walked along the ridgeline in a precise pattern, turning prepared defensive positions into smoking craters. The radio chatter was getting more animated now, less desperate. Soldiers were reporting movement, advancing on positions that had been impregnable minutes earlier. The tide was turning, and everyone in the valley could feel it. But Vex knew she was just getting started. The tactics manual said that a single A-10 could provide close air support for a battalion-sized element for approximately 45 minutes before requiring refueling or rearming. Vex had never put much faith in the tactics manual, especially when American soldiers were counting on her to prove it wrong. She'd been in the air for 18 hours, operating on nothing but discipline and the knowledge that her fuel gauges still showed green. Her weapons loadout was depleting, but she still had options: Maverick missiles for hardened targets, more rockets for area suppression, and enough cannon ammunition to make several more strafing runs. Ground control, Reaper 6-1. I'm seeing movement from the western approach. Looks like reinforcements trying to reach the fight. Through her targeting pod, she could see a convoy of vehicles moving along the winding mountain road that led into the valley. The vehicles were spaced for tactical movement, their heat signatures bright against the cool mountain air. If they reached the battle area, they would tip the balance back toward the enemy. Reaper 6-1, cleared to engage, came the immediate response. Those vehicles are definitely hostile. Vex selected her remaining Maverick missiles and began designating targets. The AGM-65 Mavericks were precision weapons, each one capable of destroying an armored vehicle with surgical accuracy. She had 4 missiles left, and she counted 7 vehicles in the convoy. The math was simple, but not impossible. She fired the first pair of missiles at the lead and trailing vehicles, effectively trapping the convoy on the narrow mountain road. The explosions were visible even from her altitude, bright flowers of orange fire that briefly illuminated the mountainside. The convoy stopped, vehicles scattered, but they had nowhere to go. Her second pair of missiles took out the largest vehicles, probably troop carriers or supply trucks. The remaining 3 vehicles were smaller, more agile, but also more vulnerable to cannon fire. Beginning gun run on remaining vehicles, she announced, rolling into another attack dive. The strafing runs that followed were textbook examples of close air support. Each pass was calculated to maximum effect, while minimizing the risk of hitting friendly forces or civilian targets. The depleted uranium rounds punched through vehicle armor like it was made of paper, turning potential reinforcements into burning wrecks scattered along the mountain road. When the smoke cleared, nothing was moving on the western approach. In the valley below, Colonel Reeves was watching a tactical situation transform from desperate to manageable. The enemy positions that had pinned down his companies were either destroyed or abandoned. His scattered units were beginning to consolidate, casualties were being evacuated, and for the first time in hours, he had options besides praying for a miracle. "All stations ground control," he transmitted. "Begin phase line advance. Reaper 6-1 has cleared the immediate area, but stay alert for bypass positions." The response came back immediately from multiple units. "Roger, Wilco, moving now." The sound of small arms fire was diminishing, replaced by the organized movement of soldiers advancing under cover. It was a beautiful sound. Reaper 6-1 ground control. "Outstanding work up there. What's your fuel and ammunition status?" There was a pause before the pilot responded, and when she did, Reeves could hear the fatigue creeping into her voice for the first time. "Ground control, I'm showing about 20 minutes of fuel remaining. Cannon ammunition at 60%, no more missiles or rockets." 20 minutes. Reeves looked at his tactical display and calculated distances and timing. His companies could consolidate and reach the extraction point in 30 minutes, maybe 45 if they encountered resistance. The math didn't work in their favor. "Reaper 6-1, recommend you return to base for refuel and rearm. We can hold position until you return." "Negative ground control. I'm staying until your people are safe." The certainty in her voice cut through the radio static like a blade. This wasn't bravado or false heroics. It was a simple statement of professional commitment that every soldier in the valley understood instinctively. Reeves found himself smiling for the first time in hours. Whoever this pilot was, she understood what it meant to leave no one behind. Vex was running her fuel calculations for the third time, hoping the numbers would somehow improve through repetition. They didn't. With 20 minutes of fuel remaining and 45 minutes of flight time back to the nearest airfield, she was looking at what pilots politely called a challenging return journey. But the soldiers on the ground were still in contact, still taking occasional sniper fire and mortar rounds as they moved through the valley. She could see their positions through her targeting pod, small clusters of infrared signatures moving with tactical precision, but still vulnerable to the enemy positions she hadn't been able to identify yet. Ground control, Reaper 6-1. I'm going to make one more sweep of the area, see if I can find any positions you might have missed. She knew she was pushing beyond the margins of safe flight operations, but those margins had been established by people who'd never had to choose between fuel conservation and American lives. The choice wasn't difficult. Banking into a wide orbit around the valley, she began systematically scanning the terrain with her targeting pod. The infrared sensors could detect heat signatures that were invisible to the naked eye: a sniper's body heat, the warm metal of a recently fired weapon, the exhaust from a hidden vehicle. It took her 3 orbits to find what she was looking for. Ground control, I have movement in the cave system on the eastern ridge. Looks like a mortar position, approximately 6 personnel. The caves had been invisible from ground level, but from her elevated position, she could see the heat signatures moving in and out of the cave entrances. It was a perfect position for indirect fire support, protected from air attack, with excellent fields of fire over the valley floor. "Can you engage?" Colonel Reeves asked. Vex studied her weapons display. She had enough cannon ammunition for several more gun runs, but the cave positions would be difficult targets. The narrow openings and rocky overhangs would provide natural protection against all but the most precisely placed shots. "I can try," she replied, "but I'm going to have to get close." What she didn't say was that getting close meant flying low and slow through an area that still contained unknown air defense threats. It was the kind of maneuver that flight instructors used as examples of what not to do. She rolled into a steep dive anyway. The first gun run was a probing attack, designed to force the enemy to reveal their positions and capabilities. Vex came in fast and low, her aircraft skimming just above the rocky ridgeline as her cannon sent a stream of depleted uranium rounds into the cave entrances. The response was immediate and intense. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, tracer rounds reaching up toward her aircraft like deadly fingers. She could hear the distinct sound of bullets striking her fuselage, a metallic ringing that every pilot hoped never to experience. "Taking fire," she announced calmly, pulling up and away from the ridge. "Aircraft appears undamaged, continuing attack." Her second pass was more aggressive, but also more precise. She'd identified the active firing positions during her first run, and now she could target them specifically. The GAU-8 cannon was designed for precision work, and she used it like a surgeon's scalpel, placing rounds exactly where they would do the most damage. The return fire was notably lighter after her second pass. "Ground control, I think we got them," she transmitted. "No movement visible in the cave system." From the valley floor, Colonel Reeves could see the smoke rising from the eastern ridge. The mortar fire that had been harassing his advancing companies had stopped completely. His tactical display showed friendly units moving rapidly toward the extraction point, their advance no longer impeded by indirect fire. "Outstanding work, Reaper 6-1. My people are almost clear. What's your fuel status now?" The pause before her response told him everything he needed to know. Ground control, I'm showing about 8 minutes of fuel remaining. I need to start heading home. 8 minutes. Reeves checked his map one more time. The extraction point was still 15 minutes away, even moving at maximum speed, if they encountered any resistance during the final approach. Reaper 6-1, I understand your fuel situation. You've done more than enough. Safe flight home. Ground control, I'll be monitoring this frequency until you're all out of the valley. If something goes wrong, I still have ammunition. Reeves understood what she wasn't saying. With 8 minutes of fuel, she could make one more attack run, maybe two if she was willing to accept the consequences of running completely dry. It was the kind of calculation that separated professional soldiers from everyone else. Copy that, Reaper 6-1. We'll try not to need you. Roger, Reaper 6-1 standing by. The next 12 minutes were the longest of Colonel Reeves' military career. His companies moved through the valley with disciplined urgency, leapfrogging from cover to cover as they advanced toward the extraction point. The enemy resistance had largely collapsed after the airstrikes, but scattered sniper fire and the occasional mortar round reminded everyone that the fight wasn't over. Through it all, Vex maintained her orbit above the valley, her fuel gauges showing numbers that would have made a fuel planning officer physically ill. She was operating on fumes and determination, ready to dive back into the fight if her soldiers needed her. The extraction helicopters appeared right on schedule, coming in fast and low to avoid any remaining air defense threats. The distinctive sound of rotor blades echoed off the valley walls as the aircraft settled into their landing zones, engines running, ready for immediate departure. All stations, ground control. Begin extraction sequence. First lift departing in 5 minutes. The boarding process went smoothly, with wounded soldiers loaded first and combat units maintaining security until the last possible moment. Within 10 minutes, the first wave of helicopters was lifting off, carrying half the battalion toward safety. Second lift inbound, the air mission commander announced. ETA 3 minutes. Vex watched the helicopters through her targeting pod, her fuel warning lights now illuminated across her instrument panel. She was officially flying on reserves, well beyond the point where any reasonable pilot would have departed for home. But the second lift hadn't arrived yet, and soldiers were still on the ground. That's when the mortars started falling again. The rounds came from a different direction this time, the southern ridge, from positions that had remained hidden during the earlier fighting. The explosions bracketed the landing zone, forcing the inbound helicopters to wave off their approach and circle back for another attempt. Ground control were taking indirect fire from the south, one of the helicopter pilots reported. Can't get in there until you suppress those positions. Colonel Reeves grabbed his radio handset and looked up at the night sky, knowing that somewhere in the darkness above him was a pilot who'd already given more than anyone had a right to ask. Reaper 6-1, ground control, I've got one more request for you. The response came back immediately, calm and professional despite the impossible fuel situation. Ground control, send it. I need you to find those mortars and take them out. I know your fuel situation, but my people can't extract until those positions are neutralized. Vex was already turning toward the southern ridge before Colonel Reeves finished talking. Her fuel gauges were showing amounts that were more theoretical than practical, but the math was simple. She had enough fuel for one more attack run, maybe two if she was willing to plan on landing somewhere other than an established airfield. On my way, she transmitted, keep your heads down. She found the mortar positions using their muzzle flashes as guidance, diving through darkness toward targets she could barely see. The enemy had learned to fear the sound of her approaching aircraft, and their fire slackened as she began her attack run. The cannon fire was precise and devastating, walking along the ridge line with mechanical accuracy. Each burst was calculated to maximize damage while conserving her remaining ammunition. She couldn't afford to waste rounds on suppression fire. Every shot had to count. When she pulled out of her dive, the southern ridge was quiet. The mortar fire had stopped completely, and the inbound helicopters were already adjusting their approach to the now secure landing zone. Ground control, Reaper 6-1. Positions neutralized. Your landing zone is clear. Outstanding work. Second lift is inbound now. Vex climbed to a safe altitude and watched as the extraction proceeded without further interference. The helicopters landed, loaded the remaining soldiers, and departed into the night sky within minutes. The valley that had been filled with gunfire and explosions for the past several hours was suddenly, beautifully quiet. Ground control, all personnel extracted successfully. Thanks for everything, Reaper 6-1. You saved a lot of lives tonight. Just doing my job, Vex replied, though her voice carried a note of satisfaction that spoke to professional pride and personal commitment. Glad everyone made it home. Now came the interesting part. Her fuel gauges were showing amounts that were technically insufficient for her planned return to base. She had enough fuel to reach friendly territory, but finding a suitable landing field was going to require some creative navigation, and possibly a few phone calls to local air traffic control. She wasn't worried. A-10 pilots were trained for situations exactly like this: low fuel, hostile territory, and the need to find a safe landing site using nothing but skill and determination. The aircraft was designed to operate from improvised airstrips and rough terrain, and she had enough experience to make it work. Overlord Reaper 6-1, she transmitted, switching to the command frequency. Mission complete. Requesting vectors to nearest suitable airfield for emergency fuel stop. The response was immediate and professional. Reaper 6-1, Overlord. Outstanding work tonight. We have an airfield at grid A-7 showing available for emergency recovery. Transmitting approach information now. The airfield was a small military installation, roughly 60 miles east of her current position, close enough to reach with her remaining fuel, large enough to handle her aircraft. More importantly, it was staffed with people who understood what it meant when a combat pilot declared a fuel emergency. Vex set course for the emergency field and began running through her approach checklist. The adrenaline that had sustained her through hours of combat operations was beginning to fade, replaced by the methodical focus required for precision flying with minimal fuel reserves. As she flew east through the night sky, she allowed herself a moment to think about what had just happened. She'd abandoned her assigned mission, violated several regulations regarding aircraft fuel reserves, and engaged in combat operations without proper authorization. By any reasonable standard, she was going to have some explaining to do when she landed. But somewhere behind her in the darkness, 2 companies of American soldiers were flying safely toward home because she'd been monitoring the wrong radio frequency at exactly the right time. That was the kind of mathematics that made everything else seem secondary. The emergency airfield appeared ahead of her exactly where the coordinates indicated, its runway marked by a simple line of white lights against the dark landscape. The control tower cleared her for immediate landing, no questions asked, no delays authorized. Emergency fuel meant priority handling, and everyone in the tower understood the implications. Her landing was textbook perfect despite the stress and fatigue of the past 20 hours. The A-10 touched down smoothly and rolled to a stop near the fuel trucks that were already positioning themselves alongside the taxiway. Ground crews swarmed around her aircraft, beginning the refueling process before she'd even shut down her engines. "Welcome to Forward Operating Base Granite," a young sergeant said as she climbed down from her cockpit. "We've got fuel, food, and a place to rest if you need it. Word is you've had a busy night." Vex pulled off her helmet and ran a hand through sweat-dampened hair. The night air was cool against her face, a sharp contrast to the heated cockpit she'd been occupying for the better part of a day. Around her, The organized chaos of a military airfield continued, aircraft being serviced, crews preparing for missions, the endless cycle of operations that kept the war machine functioning. "Yeah," she said finally, watching the fuel gauges begin their slow climb back toward normal levels. It was a busy night. She thought about Colonel Reeves and his soldiers, probably landing at their home base right about now, probably already beginning the process of after-action reports and casualty notifications, and all the administrative details that followed combat operations. They would write reports about the mission, about the tactical situation, about the air support that had made the difference between success and disaster. Most of them would never know her name, never know that she'd been flying for 20 hours when she heard their call for help, never know that she'd violated regulations and risked her career to provide the support they needed. That was fine. She hadn't done it for recognition or gratitude. She'd done it because when soldiers called for help, you answered. It was that simple. The fuel truck finished its work, and the ground crew chief approached her with a clipboard full of forms. Standard procedure, fuel receipts, maintenance reports, the bureaucratic trail that followed every aircraft operation. "Ma'am, we'll need you to sign off on the fuel upload," he said, offering her the clipboard. "Also, there's a message from your squadron. They want you to call in when you get a chance." Vex signed the forms and accepted the message slip. Her squadron commander was probably wondering where she'd disappeared to, why she'd gone off the assigned mission profile, and when she planned to return to base. All reasonable questions that deserved honest answers. But first, she wanted to check on her aircraft. The A-10 had taken some battle damage during the fight, bullet holes in the fuselage, possible hydraulic leaks, stress fractures from the extreme maneuvering she'd put the aircraft through. The ground crew was already beginning their inspection, looking for damage that might affect flight safety. "How does she look?" Vex asked the crew chief. "Few holes here and there, but nothing that'll keep her on the ground," he replied, running his hands along the aircraft's skin. "These birds are built tough. She'll get you home just fine." Vex nodded, feeling a familiar surge of affection for the aircraft that had carried her safely through another combat mission. The A-10 wasn't the fastest or prettiest fighter in the inventory, but it was reliable, durable, and deadly when employed correctly. Tonight, it had been all three. "Ma'am," the crew chief continued, "I've been working on these birds for 15 years, and I can tell when one's been flown hard. Whatever you did out there tonight, it must have been something special." "Just did what needed doing," Vex replied, but she found herself smiling despite her fatigue. "Thanks for getting her ready to fly. I need to head home." An hour later, Vex was airborne again, flying through the pre-dawn darkness toward her home base. The fuel gauges showed comfortable margins now, and her aircraft systems were all operating normally. The radio was quiet, tuned to routine air traffic control frequencies instead of the emergency channels that had started her night. As she flew, she thought about the events of the past few hours. The desperate radio calls, the tactical situation that had seemed hopeless, the moment when everything changed because the right person was in the right place with the right tools. It was the kind of story that would be told and retold in officer clubs and squadron-ready rooms, growing more dramatic with each telling. But for now, it was just another mission completed, another night of flying through dangerous skis to bring American soldiers home safely. That was what she'd trained for, what she'd dedicated her career to accomplishing. The recognition and awards would come later if they came at all. What mattered was that everyone had made it home. The sun was beginning to rise behind her as she approached her home airfield. The familiar sight of the runway lights and control tower filled her with a sense of completion, of mission accomplished and duty fulfilled. Ground control cleared her for landing with the routine professionalism that marked the end of thousands of combat sorties. As she touched down and taxied toward the flight line, Vex could see her squadron mates beginning their pre-flight preparations for the day's missions. The war continued. Other pilots would take their turns in the cockpit. Other soldiers would need close air support in distant valleys. The cycle never ended. But tonight, in one small valley where American soldiers had been trapped and outnumbered, the system had worked exactly as designed. When help was needed, it came. When the call went out, someone answered. That was enough. 3 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Vex Morrow stood at attention in the base auditorium, listening as the citation for her Distinguished Flying Cross was read aloud. The formal language described her actions in clinical terms: unauthorized mission deviation, exceptional airmanship, decisive engagement of enemy forces under extremely challenging conditions. What the citation didn't capture was the radio transmission she'd received the week before, patched through from Colonel Reeves' unit. His voice had been different over the phone, less strained, more reflective, but the message was clear. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know that every soldier who was in that valley that night made it home safely. Some of them had close calls, some of them will be dealing with their wounds for a while, but they're all alive. They all have families to go home to because you were listening to the radio at exactly the right moment." He'd paused then, and she could hear other voices in the background. Soldiers going about their daily duties, preparing for training exercises, living the routine life of a peacetime military unit. "I don't know what made you break off from your assigned mission to help us," Reeves had continued, "but I want you to know that it mattered. It made all the difference in the world." Standing in the auditorium, listening to the applause that followed the reading of her citation, Vex thought about that phone call. She thought about the soldiers who were alive today because she'd made a choice to answer when help was needed. She thought about the families who wouldn't have to endure the knock on the door that every military family dreaded. The medal was nice, but the phone call had meant more. After the ceremony, as she stood in the receiving line shaking hands with senior officers and accepting congratulations, her squadron commander pulled her aside. "Outstanding work, Vex," Colonel Harrison said. "You've brought credit to the squadron and the Air Force. You should be proud." "Thank you, sir. Just did what needed doing." "That's what makes it outstanding," Harrison replied. "Anyone can follow orders and stick to the mission plan. It takes real leadership to recognize when the mission plan isn't good enough." Vex nodded, understanding the deeper message. Military operations were built on discipline and adherence to procedures, but they were ultimately about people: soldiers in contact, pilots in cockpits, commanders making decisions with incomplete information. Sometimes the book answer wasn't the right answer. "There's one more thing," Harrison continued. "I've been asked to tell you that your actions that night are being studied at the Air Force Weapons School. They want to use your mission as a case study in close air support operations and tactical decision-making." The idea that her split-second decision to answer a distress call would become part of official doctrine was both humbling and slightly surreal. She'd been flying on instinct and experience, not trying to establish new tactical procedures. "I hope they include the part about fuel management," she said dryly. "That was probably the most challenging aspect of the whole mission." Harrison laughed. "I'm sure they will, but the important lesson is about being ready to adapt when the situation demands it. That's something you can't really teach in a classroom." As the reception wound down and people began to disperse, Vex found herself thinking about the future. Her career would continue. There would be other missions, other challenges. The war would eventually end, and she would transition to peacetime flying, training the next generation of pilots, passing on the lessons she'd learned in valleys and deserts and mountains around the world. But she knew that no matter what came next, she would always be defined by the moment when she heard a desperate voice on the radio and chose to answer. It was the kind of decision that revealed character, that separated professionals from amateurs, that made the difference between coming home and not coming home. Standing in the parking lot outside the auditorium, Looking up at the night sky where other pilots were flying other missions, Vex felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She'd chosen the right profession, trained with the right people, been in the right place when it mattered most. Tomorrow there would be more missions, more challenges, more opportunities to make a difference. Tonight, she was content knowing that when the call came, she'd answered. It was enough. Years later, when Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Vex Morrow transitioned from active duty to civilian life, she carried with her the knowledge that her legacy was measured not in the medals on her chest or the commendations in her personnel file, but in the soldiers who came home, because she'd been listening to the radio on the right frequency at exactly the right moment. The war ended, as wars always do, and the valley where Colonel Reeves and his soldiers had been trapped returned to the kind of peaceful obscurity that made the sacrifice seem almost abstract. But in squadron-ready rooms and officer clubs, in classrooms at the Air Force Academy and training facilities around the world, the story continued to be told. It became a legend of sorts. The A-10 pilot who broke off from her assigned mission to save a trapped infantry unit, who flew for 20 hours and landed on fumes because American soldiers needed help. The details grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core message remained the same. When the call comes, you answer. Vex never tried to correct the embellishments or downplay the mythology that grew up around that night. She understood that military legends served a purpose beyond historical accuracy. They taught lessons about duty and sacrifice, and the kind of split-second decisions that defined careers and saved lives. What mattered was that somewhere in squadrons around the world, young pilots heard the story and internalized its lesson. When their moment came, when they heard the desperate voice on the radio calling for help, they would remember the pilot who answered when backup was impossible. They would answer too. The sky never forgot its own. In the endless blue above valleys and mountains and deserts where Americans fought and died and came home again, the legend of Reaper 61 lived on. Not as a story about exceptional heroism, but as a reminder of what it meant to be ready when ordinary people needed someone extraordinary. In the end, that was enough. It was everything.